Hi guys. I hope you're doing well tonight. Before we begin, I have a small question for you. Where are you listening from, and what time is it where you are right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine. Some of you might be listening under a warm blanket, maybe with rain against the window, or maybe far away, in the middle of the day, with sunlight touching your room. Wherever you are, just settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. Because tonight, I'll tell you a story that comes not from the marble of Rome, but from its edges, from the provinces, where life was rougher, poorer, and perhaps more real. This is the story of a man who fought not in the Colosseum, but in small, forgotten arenas. The kind built from cracked stones and wooden planks, surrounded by olive trees and dry grass. His name was Gaius Marcellus, a name once shouted by peasants and drunk merchants in dusty towns, and then forgotten like everything else that happens far from the capital. He was not born to fight. No one ever truly is. He was born a slave, though he remembered little of how he came to be one. He once said, in the quiet of his years, that the first thing he remembered clearly was dust. That hot, reddish dust that clung to the skin, to the sandals, to every thought of the men who lived under the sun of the provinces. That was his Rome, not marble, but dust. The arena where he first fought wasn't grand. It stood near a fishing town on the southern coast, where the smell of salt mixed with the scent of dried blood and cheap wine. The walls were made of rough stone, half covered in ivy. At its edge, a few merchants sold amulets, figs, and oil. Children peeked through the gaps in the wooden stands, trying to see who would die that day. It wasn't the Colosseum. But for those who came to watch, it was their own Rome. When Gaius first stood inside that circle of sand, he was still young, barely 20, with the eyes of someone who hadn't yet learned how to hate or to hope. The crowd didn't roar like in the capital. They murmured, they gossiped, they shouted names they barely knew. He could hear a man arguing about the price of bread even as he raised his shield. A dog barked outside the walls. A woman laughed. Life and death shared the same space. The sun was merciless that day. You could almost hear it pressing down on the iron, making it hiss when sweat touched it. Gaius could smell his own fear, that bitter scent that no perfume could hide. His opponent was another slave, a man from Gaul, huge and silent, with hair the color of burnt straw. They had shared the same food, the same training yard, even the same bucket of water in the morning. And now, they were told to kill each other for the amusement of strangers. That's how it was on the provincial arenas. No nobles in white togas. No senators deciding who lived or died. Only the local magistrate, sitting with a cup of watered wine, pretending to be important. Only the dusty faces of people who wanted something to feel. The fights weren't grand spectacles, they were distractions. For them, a man's death was a brief holiday from the boredom of surviving. The Gaul attacked first, heavy, clumsy, desperate. Gaius barely blocked the blow. He remembered the clang of metal, the weight of the shield, the sharp burn in his arm. But most of all, he remembered the dust. Every movement raised a cloud of it, soft and glowing in the sunlight. It filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes, until all he could see was the blur of gold and red and the trembling heat above the sand. When the Gaul fell, the crowd didn't cheer right away. They were unsure if it was over. And when the blood finally sank into the ground, a few clapped, a few turned away. A boy threw a handful of olives into the arena, laughing. Gaius stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the spot where life had ended, and thought, for the first time, that maybe he'd already died long ago. When he stopped remembering the place he came from. Later that evening, when the crowd had gone, he sat by the gate where the sand met the grass. The air was still heavy with the day's heat. The slaves were cleaning the weapons, washing away what was left of the fight. In the distance, he could hear music, someone playing a flute, soft and trembling. The world continued, as if nothing had happened, as if no one had bled for their amusement. And yet, he felt something. Not pride, not shame. Something quieter, a kind of numb peace, like the silence after a storm. He didn't know it then, but he would fight again and again, in other towns, other arenas, under other skies. He would see the faces of thousands who would never remember his name. But in that moment, sitting in the reddish dust, Gaius Marcellus became part of the strange, unspoken rhythm of the empire. The rhythm of the forgotten. They say that in Rome, the sand of the Colosseum was changed often, washed and raked to keep it golden and pure. But in the provinces, it stayed the same. Every drop of blood mixed into it, until the ground itself became a memory of all who had fallen, and all who still would. And as night came, and the last torch flickered on the crumbling wall, the dust settled once more, covering everything. The blood, the footsteps, the dreams. It was as if the arena, too, wished to forget. The morning after the fight smelled of iron and rain. The sea had brought a storm during the night, short, violent, and full of thunder that shook the thin roofs of the fishermen's huts. By dawn, everything was still again. The sky had turned a washed-out gray, and a slow wind pushed the scent of salt inland, over the empty market stalls and along the broken road that led to the Ludus, the Gladiator's school. That was where Gaius Marcellus was sent. He didn't know if it was a punishment or a reward. Some said that those who survived their first fight were valuable. Others said they were dangerous. But either way, he was placed on a cart with 3 other men, all silent, all wrapped in coarse wool, their wrists still bound with rope. The road was narrow and uneven, carved between dry hills where the grass had burned away months ago. Occasionally, they passed small farms, lonely houses of clay and timber, chickens wandering freely, a child staring as the cart rolled by. None of them waved. None of them spoke. To see chained men was nothing new. The Ludus stood beyond a low ridge of rock, hidden from the town. It wasn't like the schools in Rome, no marble columns, no grand courtyards. It was a square of stone walls and wooden roofs, surrounded by olive trees that never seemed to move. From the gate, Gaius could hear the dull rhythm of training, iron striking wood, the thud of shields, the sharp bark of a voice calling commands. It sounded more like a forge than a place for men. The guard who greeted them had a crooked scar across his face and a missing ear. He looked at Gaius for a long time before saying anything. "Another one from the southern coast," he muttered. "They keep sending them broken." Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound, and motioned for the cart to enter. Inside, the yard was filled with men. Some were huge, broad-backed, scarred, and marked with tattoos of distant tribes. Others were thin and quiet, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and deliberate. Everyone smelled of sweat, oil, and dust. The air was heavy, almost too thick to breathe. Gaius and the others were given water, stale, but cold. Then they were lined up before a man who looked older than all of them, but whose posture carried the weight of command. His name was Quintus Varanus, once a gladiator himself, now a lanista, a trainer, a keeper of men who lived and died for coin. Quintus studied Gaius without expression. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. Gaius didn't answer. He wasn't sure he did. "Because you lived," Quintus said. "And that means you might live again." He walked down the line, tapping each man on the shoulder with a wooden stick. "You'll eat when I say, sleep when I say, Fight when I say. And when you die, and you will, I'll decide whether it's a good death or a useless one. He stopped before Gaius again. What's your name? Gaius, he said. Not anymore, the old man replied. Here, your Corvus, the raven. It suits you. That was how he received his arena name. Every fighter had one, a mask for the crowd, a story to make their deaths more memorable. There was Ursus, the bear, Leo, the lion, Sura, the knife. But Gaius, now Corvus, found something oddly fitting in it. A raven was neither noble nor fierce, only patient and always watching. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the ludus became his world. They trained under the sun until the air shimmered with heat. The ground was packed hard with footprints and blood. Each morning began with the sound of the horn, followed by the shuffle of sandals, the clang of shields, and the smell of barley porridge. Then came the drills, endless repetition of the same cuts, the same stances, the same movements. The wooden swords were heavier than real ones, designed to make their arms ache. Their armor was mismatched, old helmets from past fighters, dented shields, cracked greaves. Every piece carried a memory of someone who no longer breathed. There were moments, though, when life showed its quieter face. At night, when the torches burned low, the men would sit by the fence, talking softly. They told stories, half-truths, half-dreams, of home, of women, of gods that might still listen. One of them, a tall German named Armin, would carve small birds out of olive wood. He said it kept his hands calm before a fight. He gave one to Gaius, a raven of course, and told him to keep it close, for luck. Sometimes they heard music drifting from the town, a flute, or the laughter of people celebrating something unknown. It always sounded impossibly distant, like the echo of another life. The men would fall silent, listening, until the sound faded. Then they would return to sharpening their blades. Because dreaming was dangerous here. Quintus taught them not just to fight, but to perform. He said, the crowd doesn't care who wins. They care who makes them feel. So they learned to fight slowly, dramatically, with pauses and gestures. Like actors in a tragedy where the script always ended in death. It wasn't battle, it was theater. A cruel, dusty theater where the applause came too late to matter. And yet, Gaius began to feel something strange. Not joy, but a kind of belonging. For the first time, his days had rhythm. Pain had a purpose. The men he trained with became brothers, not by choice, but by the certainty that they would all share the same fate. There was comfort in that. On one evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Quintus stood watching them from the edge of the yard. He said quietly, "You'll all fight soon. Not in Rome. Rome has its own gods. You'll fight for farmers and fishermen, for merchants and thieves. They'll forget your names by nightfall. But for one moment, when you raise your sword and they scream, you'll exist more than they ever will." Gaius didn't know if that was wisdom or madness. He only knew that something inside him changed that night. He stopped counting the days. He stopped waiting to be free. He began to listen to the rhythm of the iron, the breathing of the men beside him, and the quiet whisper of the olive trees that grew beyond the walls, as if they, too, were waiting for the next morning's horn. And so, the raven learned to fight. Not for glory, not for life, but because the dust demanded it. Because in the provinces, even the wind carried the sound of iron. The day of the festival came with the smell of roasted meat and smoke. Even before dawn, the air around the town was restless. Dogs barking, merchants shouting, carts creaking under the weight of figs, olives, and cheap wine. It was the kind of morning when the whole world seemed to hum with expectation. And at the heart of it all, the small arena waited, silent, like a sleeping animal. Gaius, Corvus, as the others called him now, rose before the horns sounded. The sky was still dark, the stars pale and trembling. He sat on the edge of his cot, listening to the faint snores of men who might not live to see another sunrise. In the shadows, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else laughed softly, trying to sound fearless. And outside, the first voices of the crowd began to drift through the air like smoke. The Ludus gates opened with a groan. They walked in single file down the narrow road that led to the town square. A procession of men in leather and iron, faces painted with ash, eyes fixed forward. Children followed them for a while, throwing flowers or pebbles, shouting the names they'd learned from rumor and gossip. Leo, Ursus, Corvus. To them, the gladiators weren't slaves. They were something else, half-gods, half-doomed men. A living myth that came once a year, like thunder from a clear sky. The arena itself was small, only a ring of stone. It stands barely high enough to keep the crowd from spilling onto the sand. Above the gate hung faded banners, red, gold, and green. And the wooden seats were already full, creaking under the weight of farmers, merchants, and their families. The smell of sweat and wine mixed with the sweetness of honey cakes. In the front row sat the magistrate, a man with rings on every finger and a permanent smile that never reached his eyes. Beside him, 2 guards leaned on their spears, looking bored. When the horn sounded, the noise of the crowd rose like a wave. It wasn't the deep roar of the Colosseum, it was a rough, uneven chorus, filled with laughter, curses, and the crack of wooden cups against stone. But to Gaius, it was enough. It was the sound of being seen. They began with mock fights, pairs of trainees, barely armed, clashing for the crowd's amusement. The spectators shouted advice, bet on who would fall first, and laughed when someone tripped. Then came the animal fights, dogs against wild boars, small and frantic, the kind of blood that satisfied no one but drew everyone closer. And finally, the gladiators themselves stepped forward. The real show. Quintus stood at the gate, watching them with that same calm expression he always wore. He whispered to each man as they passed, "Remember your movements. Make them feel." When Gaius entered, the light struck his armor like fire. The dust rose under his feet, glowing gold in the sunlight. He felt the weight of the helmet on his head, the leather cutting into his shoulders, the heat crawling down his spine. His opponent was a man he knew well. Sura, quick and clever, his blade as sharp as his tongue. They had trained side by side for months, sharing food, jokes, and bruises. Now, they had to make death look beautiful. The horn blew again. They circled each other slowly, shields raised, swords twitching like restless animals. The crowd fell into a hush, a single breath held by hundreds. And then, the rhythm began. Clash. Step. Dust. The sound of metal on metal. The thud of a foot against sand. They moved like dancers, rehearsed, but unpredictable, each strike carrying the weight of real danger. One mistake, and the play would turn to truth. Gaius could feel the world narrowing. No faces, no noise, only the rhythm of his heartbeat. He ducked, twisted, struck low. Sura staggered, then smiled. The smile of someone who knew his role. They fought until their breath came ragged, until the dust clung to their sweat like a second skin. And when Gaius disarmed him, the sword flying, the crowd gasping, Sura dropped to one knee, chest rising and falling. The crowd shouted for the final blow. Some screamed, "Kill!" Others waved their hands in the old sign of mercy. The magistrate waited, pretending to ponder the decision, though everyone knew how this day would end. Then his hand turned, thumb down. It was over in a heartbeat. The sword entered with a dull sound, not like in stories, but like wood breaking. Sura's body went still. The sand turned dark beneath him. The crowd cheered. Later, they would say it was a good fight. They would remember how well Corvus had moved, how noble he had looked when he saluted the magistrate. They would drink to his skill, laugh, and forget. By morning, his name would be another whisper in the tavern smoke. When night fell, the arena was empty again. The torches burned low, throwing long shadows across the sand. The men who survived sat in silence, cleaning their weapons. Gaius looked at his sword, at the small crack near the hilt, and wondered how many lives it had taken, how many more it would demand. In the corner, Armin, the German, was carving another wooden bird. He handed it to Gaius without a word. It was smaller than the last one, rougher, unfinished. But when Gaius held it in his palm, he felt something shift. Not joy, not grief, but a faint awareness that he was still alive. Outside the walls, the music of the festival drifted through the air. Laughter, drums, the cry of merchants selling the last of their wine. The world kept celebrating, as if blood was only another color of the evening. And somewhere above, in the dark sky, a raven crossed the moon, silent and unseen. The morning after the festival always felt like a hangover for the entire town. The air was quieter, the market stalls half empty, and even the gulls circling over the harbor moved slower, as if they too had tired of the noise and blood. But inside the ludus, the rhythm never stopped. The horn still sounded. The drills still began. Because in this place, celebration was for those who watched, not for those who fought. Gaius woke before dawn again. His arms ached from the fight, and his side still throbbed where Sura's blade had grazed him. The wound wasn't deep, but it carried a strange warmth, a reminder of how thin the line was between life and death. He ran his fingers across the scar and thought of Sura's face. Not the moment of death, but the way he had smiled before it came. That small, calm smile, as if he'd already made peace with everything. The lanista, Quintus, said little after the games. He simply inspected the men, nodded once, and ordered them back to training. But Gaius could feel something in the way Quintus looked at him now. Not pride, not affection, but a measured interest. A man who had proven useful. A man who could be sold for more. Later that day, as the sun rose higher and the heat turned the courtyard into a shimmering mirage, Quintus called for him. They met under the olive trees by the wall, the only spot in the yard where there was shade. Quintus leaned on his staff, his eyes half closed against the glare. "You fought well," he said. "Better than I expected. You have control. The crowd loves that." Gaius didn't reply. He didn't know what to say. Quintus smirked. "Don't look so proud. You're not free yet. Not even close." He pointed toward the distant hills beyond the wall. "Do you see them? There's a road that leads north, through the passes, into the forests. Every few months, one of you tries to take it. You know how it ends." Gaius said quietly, "Maybe one day, it won't." Quintus gave a dry laugh. "Then perhaps the gods will tell me before it happens." That night, the men sat in the sleeping quarters, the oil lamps flickering low. Someone was sharpening a dagger on a stone, slow and steady. Armin spoke first. "You ever think about what freedom really is?" The question hung in the air like dust. No one answered. Finally, Gaius said, "I used to, before I knew how much it costs." Armin nodded. "In my village, before the Romans came, freedom meant land, a fire, a roof. Here, it's just a word people whisper before they die." He looked up. "But still, I think about it. There were always stories in the ludus. Whispers of men who escaped, through bribes, tunnels, or sheer luck. Some said they joined bandits in the mountains, others that they became soldiers in foreign lands. Most likely, they were caught and nailed to crosses along the road. But even knowing that, the stories never died. They lived in the quiet spaces between training and sleep, in the moments when the mind wandered beyond the walls. One evening, when the moon was low and red over the hills, a newcomer arrived. He was older than most, tall, thin, with deep lines across his face and a limp in one leg. He said little, but the way he carried himself made even the veterans glance his way. They called him Lupus, the wolf, and from the first night, he began to speak of things no one else dared to say aloud. He talked about Rome, how the great arenas there overflowed with wealth, how emperors paid in gold for a single performance. And then he spoke of what lay beyond Rome, the forests, the rivers, the far edges of the empire where Roman law faded like smoke. There are places, he whispered, where a man can disappear, where no one asks where you came from or what you did. His eyes shone in the firelight, wild and alive. Freedom, he said softly, isn't something they can give. It's something you take. That night, Gaius couldn't sleep. He listened to the creak of the wooden beams above him, the slow breathing of the others. He thought of the hills beyond the town, the sound of the sea far below, and the idea that somewhere, the air might be different, lighter, untouched by the smell of blood and iron. But even as he imagined it, he felt the weight of the iron collar around his neck, and the memory of Quintus's voice. "You're not free yet." Days passed. Training continued. But something in Gaius began to shift. He started noticing things he hadn't before. The cracks in the wall near the western gate, the way the guards changed shifts at dusk, the small moments when the world seemed to turn its back. Freedom, he realized, wasn't just a dream. It was a pattern, hidden in plain sight. And yet, every time he thought of leaving, something stopped him. Not fear, exactly, but a strange attachment to the life he knew. The rhythm of the arena, the sound of iron, the faces of the men beside him. He didn't belong anywhere else. He had become part of the machine that devoured men and spat out legends. One evening, as the sun sank low, he sat near the gate, watching the light fade from the sky. Armin joined him, silent at first. Then he said, "Do you think we'd know what to do if we were free?" Gaius looked at him, the question hanging between them like smoke. "I don't know," he said at last. "Maybe freedom is just another kind of arena, only bigger." The wind carried the faint sound of bells from the town. The end of another day, another round of wine and laughter for those who never had to bleed for their amusement. Gaius closed his eyes and let the sound fade. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once, then fell silent. And when the night finally settled over the ludus, the chains clinked softly as the men turned in their sleep, a reminder that even dreams had weight. The forge stood on the edge of Capua, half hidden behind a row of olive trees. To most who passed by, it was nothing. A low stone building, smoke rising from its chimney, the steady ringing of hammer against anvil echoing faintly across the valley. But to those who lived by the sword, that sound was life itself. It was the song of survival, the rhythm that shaped every blade, every piece of armor that stood between a man and death. Inside, the air shimmered with heat. The smell of iron and coal clung to everything, the walls, the floor, even the men who worked there. Their arms were blackened with soot, their faces lined with years of firelight and exhaustion. But their hands moved with a strange, deliberate grace. They knew the language of metal, the way it spoke when heated, the way it sang when struck just right. The master of the forge was a man called Cassian. He was neither young nor old, his hair already silvered at the temples, his eyes sharp despite the smoke. He had once been a soldier, or so the rumor went, perhaps even a legionary. But now, he served a quieter kind of war. He made the weapons that others would use to die. Every morning, the first rays of sun would slide through the small window above his workbench, catching the rising steam from the quenching barrel. Cassian would pause for just a moment, his hammer resting against the anvil, watching how the light danced on the blades. Then he would sigh softly, pick up the metal again, and strike. Clang, clang, clang. Each blow echoed like a heartbeat. One afternoon, a group of guards from the Ludus arrived. Their armor was dusty from the road, their voices loud with arrogance. Behind them followed a cart covered in canvas. When they pulled the cover aside, Cassian saw what lay beneath: broken swords, dented helmets, shields split clean in two. The aftermath of the festival games. And among the shattered iron, something else, a single blood-stained gladius, its hilt worn smooth by use. The headguard, a tall man with a scar across his jaw, tossed a coin purse onto the table. The Lanista wants these reforged by the week's end. And new ones, 12, maybe more. He says the crowd is hungry again. Cassian nodded without looking up. He'd heard it all before. The crowd was always hungry. After they left, Cassian took the bloodstained sword and set it aside. He could tell immediately that it was different. The balance was perfect, the steel resilient, the edge still keen despite the damage. Whoever had wielded it had known how to fight, not with brute force, but with understanding. He cleaned the blade slowly, his eyes tracing the small cracks along the fuller. In the faint light, he thought he saw the reflection of a man, tired, scarred, but alive. Whose sword was this? He asked one of his apprentices. The boy shrugged. They said it belonged to a Thracian, one who killed 4 men before he fell. Cassian frowned slightly. Fell? Or survived? The boy hesitated. They said he lived. Won his freedom, maybe. Cassian said nothing. He just set the blade aside, as if it had more to tell him later. That night, when the forge was silent and the others had gone, he stayed behind. He lit a small lamp and began to work alone. The world outside was still, only the faint chirping of insects and the whisper of wind through the olive trees. He heated the sword until it glowed red, then hammered it gently, whispering to himself as he worked. It wasn't prayer exactly, but something close to it. For men like him, creation was the only form of worship left. As he worked, he thought of the men who would hold these blades. The gladiators, slaves, criminals, strangers, each bound by fate to a weapon forged in this very room. He imagined them standing in the arena, hearing the roar of the crowd, feeling the weight of his work in their hands. Every strike of his hammer might one day mean life or death. And yet, the world never remembered the forger, only the fighter. Once, long ago, Cassian had fought too. He remembered the sound of battle, the screams, the dust, the chaos. He remembered the cold shock of steel meeting flesh. And he remembered how quickly glory faded when the war was done. That was when he turned to the forge. The hammer was steadier than the sword, the fire more honest than the blood. Near midnight, the door creaked open. Cassian looked up, startled. A shadow stood in the doorway, tall, lean, wrapped in a worn cloak. When the man stepped into the light, Cassian saw the scars on his arms, the mark of the ludus on his shoulder. It was Gaius. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at the half-finished weapons, the glow of the forge reflected in his eyes. Then he said quietly, "I thought I'd see where the gods are born." Cassian smiled faintly. "Gods." Gaius gestured toward the blades. "That's what the crowd calls us. But I think this is where they make us." Cassion studied him for a moment. You're the Thracian, aren't you? The one who lived. Gaius didn't deny it. They gave me a new sword, he said. It feels wrong. Too light. Too clean. Cassion nodded. The best ones always do. They stood there for a while in silence, the only sound the crackle of coals. Then Cassion spoke again, his voice low. You know, every piece of iron carries memory. Heat it long enough, and it forgets what it was. Shape it right, and it becomes something new. But it always remembers the fire. Gaius looked at him, uncertain if the man spoke of metal, or of men. He left before dawn, his face hidden beneath the hood. Cassion watched him go, the faint clink of chains echoing in the dark. Then he turned back to the anvil, and lifted the hammer once more. The first strike rang out across the hills, a lonely note swallowed by the wind. Clang, clang, clang. It was the sound of creation, the sound of destruction, the sound of Rome itself, endless, merciless, and eternal. The morning after his visit to the forge, Gaius awoke to the taste of iron in his mouth. His back burned where the scars of old lashes met fresh bruises. The sun had only just begun to creep over the low roofs of Capua, and already the air was heavy with heat and dust. He tried to rise, but his body rebelled. The ache ran deep, past the muscle, down into the bone. He had fought again the day before, not to the death, but close enough to smell it. And death, he thought, had a particular scent, like rust and smoke and sweat that never quite washed away. From the corridor outside came the sound of chains and muted voices. The Lanista's men were making their rounds, counting the fighters like livestock. In another cell, someone coughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed off the stone. Someone else groaned softly in their sleep. This was the quietest hour of the ludus, the fragile stillness before the drills, before the shouting began. But that morning, Gaius was not called to train. Instead, a guard opened his cell with a grunt and motioned for him to follow. The air in the hallway was cool, smelling faintly of oil and wine. They led him not to the yard, but to a small room at the edge of the compound, the infirmary. Inside, the light was dim, filtered through strips of fabric hung to keep out the flies. Shelves lined the walls, filled with clay jars and bronze instruments whose purposes Gaius could only guess at. A basin of water sat on a low table beside a set of scalpels and curved hooks. The smell was sharp, vinegar, herbs, and something metallic beneath it all. The physician looked up from his work as they entered. He was a thin man with a narrow face and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to sleep. A slave himself, though of a different kind. He was called Menander, a Greek, once a student in Pergamon, now healer to those who fought for Rome's amusement. Sit, Menander said, gesturing to the bench. His Latin carried the soft accent of the Aegean. Gaius obeyed, lowering himself slowly as pain flared along his ribs. The physician began to clean the cuts along his arm, his movements precise but not unkind. You fought well yesterday, he murmured, dipping a cloth in wine and pressing it to a wound. The crowd liked you. Gaius gave a faint laugh. The crowd likes anyone who bleeds enough. Menander smiled thinly. Yes, but not everyone lives long enough to do it twice. He moved with quiet confidence, selecting herbs from a tray, crushed bay leaves, myrrh, and dried marigold. As he worked, he spoke softly, almost as if to himself. They used to teach us that the body was ruled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of anyone, and the body suffers imbalance. Here, he tapped Gaius's chest lightly. You have too much heat, inflammation, anger, exhaustion. You need cooling, rest, water, and perhaps a little peace. Gaius smiled weakly. Peace? You'll find none of that here. Menander gave a small nod. Then we use what we have. The gods are merciful, but herbs are more reliable. He turned to a pot simmering gently over a small brazier and ladled out a bitter-smelling concoction. It steamed in the cool air, the scent of fennel and wormwood rising with it. Drink, he said. It will steady your breath and dull the pain. Gaius took it, grimaced at the taste, and swallowed it down. The physician began to speak again, not looking up from his work. Do you know what I find most curious about you men? Gaius raised an eyebrow. You live every day as if you will die tomorrow. Yet you cling to life more fiercely than any senator in Rome. Gaius thought about that for a moment. Maybe because life only feels real when death is close. Menander's hands paused. He looked at Gaius then, truly looked, not as one studies a patient, but as one studies a mirror. I used to think knowledge was the key to freedom, he said softly. But here, it only binds me tighter. He gestured around the small room, the jars, the scalpels, the herbs. All this. I use it to heal men so they can go out and be broken again. The silence between them grew heavy. Outside, the distant sound of wooden swords striking echoed faintly. Training had begun. The rhythm of the blows rose and fell like a heartbeat. Menander turned back to his work, wrapping Gaius's arm with clean linen. I once treated a man like you, he said after a while. A Gaul. Enormous, strong as a bull. He fought for years. Every scar on his body was a map of pain. When he finally won his freedom, they gave him a purse of silver and a laurel crown. He tied off the bandage and glanced up. Do you know what he did with it? Gaius shook his head. He came back a month later, to fight again. Said freedom was too quiet. Gaius said nothing, but inside, the words lodged deep. Freedom, he could hardly remember what that felt like. The idea of it seemed distant, almost unreal, like a memory from another life. Menander began to clean the table, humming softly under his breath. The tune was old, a Greek melody, perhaps one he'd learned as a boy. When he noticed Gaius listening, he smiled faintly. My mother used to sing this while tending the sick. She said it kept away evil spirits. Gaius looked at the man's tired face, at the hands that worked without rest, and said quietly, Maybe it still does. Before leaving, Gaius turned to him. Tell me something, healer. Why do you stay? Menander paused, then answered without turning. Because even in a place built for death, someone must remember how to save life. Gaius stepped back into the sun, the heat wrapping around him like a cloak. The sounds of the ludus filled the air again, the clatter of weapons, the shouted orders, the dull thud of flesh meeting wood. He felt the ache in his ribs, but also something else, a strange clarity. In the forge, men shaped iron. Here, Menander shaped survival. And somewhere deep within, Gaius began to wonder which craft was harder. The cart rattled over the uneven road, its wheels groaning against the rocky path. The sun had barely risen, turning the sky pale gold, and the wind brought with it the scent of wild herbs and distant fields. Gaius sat with the other gladiators, the ropes around his wrists digging into his skin, the coarse wool of his tunic sticking to his back with sweat. None of them spoke much. There was no need. The rhythm of the cart, the creak of the harnesses, the faint neigh of horses, it was enough to keep their thoughts moving without words. They were leaving Capua. The town behind them shrank into the dust, its walls and rooftops blurring into the horizon. Ahead lay a series of villages, scattered like broken stones across the rolling hills. Each one would have its arena, small, rough-hewn, and already filled with expectation. Each one would have its crowd, curious, restless, hungry for the spectacle of men dancing with death. The journey was long. By midday, the sun pressed down on the cart with a weight that made the air shimmer and the men groan. They passed farms and orchards, the scent of ripening fruit mixing with the dust kicked up by the wheels. A shepherd waved as they passed, children ran alongside, their laughter trailing after them like a fragile thread of normalcy. But none of it touched the men on the cart. They were prisoners of the road, of fate, of the anticipation that awaited them in every village. Gaius watched the hills roll past, thinking of the forge and the infirmary, the places that had shaped him, kept him alive. He thought of the wooden raven Armin had carved for him, now tucked inside his tunic. A small reminder that, even in a world of blood and iron, some things survived. And he wondered, quietly, whether survival was enough. As the sun climbed higher, they approached their first stop, a town no larger than a cluster of huts, surrounded by low walls of cracked stone. Already, voices carried over the fields, merchants calling, children laughing, the sound of animals stirring in their pens. And above it all, a strange, low murmur, the crowd gathering near the arena, their excitement barely contained. It was a sound that made Gaius's heart tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, something deeper, older, like a warning whispered long ago. The arena was little more than a circle of sand surrounded by wooden planks. The stands were filled with peasants, farmers, and tradesmen, their faces eager, their hands clutching whatever they had brought to see the spectacle. Some carried cups of wine, others baskets of food, all eager to witness men fight for their amusement. The magistrate, small and stout, sat at the center with a bronze staff in hand, pretending authority. The air smelled of sweat, dust, and anticipation, the peculiar, inescapable perfume of expectation. Gaius disembarked from the cart with careful steps, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. The sun beat relentlessly on his helmet, and the sand beneath his feet clung stubbornly to his sandals. He could hear the shouts of children, the low hum of conversation, the occasional bark of a dog. All mundane sounds, but all part of the rhythm of life that seemed to go on despite the shadow of death looming in the circle ahead. They were herded into the holding area, a small pen of wood and rope where they could watch the arena without entering it. Here, they waited, listening as the crowd's murmurs grew louder, tasting the dust in the air, and feeling the anticipation thrum through their veins. Every man here knew that the fight would not be graceful. There would be no choreography, no moment to pause and show off skill. It would be raw, brutal, unpolished, and that was exactly what the people wanted. Gaius's thoughts wandered to Menander's words, to the quiet moments in the infirmary when life had been tended and preserved. He wondered if the healer knew how close they all were to being broken again, and he thought of the forge, of Cassion shaping iron into instruments of survival, and realized that these weapons were not just tools, they were extensions of the men themselves, each scar and dent a map of experience. Hours passed. The crowd grew restless. Voices rose in demand. The first match would begin soon. The magistrate raised his staff, signaling the start. The cart wheels had stopped. The men stepped forward. The sand shifted beneath their feet. Gaius felt it rise and cling to him, as though the earth itself were reminding him of its presence, its power. The arena awaited, small and unremarkable to the world, but immense in its significance to those who would enter it. He took a deep breath, feeling the rhythm of his own heartbeat echo the distant clatter of training swords. And then, slowly, he stepped into the circle, feeling the eyes of the villagers upon him, their expectations pressing down like the sun itself. Somewhere in the back of the arena, a child clutched a wooden toy sword and whispered, "Fight well, Corvus." Gaius's fingers brushed the hilt of his own weapon. The moment had arrived. and the sand, red and stubborn, waited to hold their story. The arena was small, but in its confines, the world seemed immense. Gaius, Corvus, stepped onto the sand, feeling it shift beneath his feet, soft and uneven, clinging stubbornly to his sandals. The crowd pressed forward on the wooden stands, a patchwork of faces, all bright with expectation, all hungry for the spectacle. There were children with wide eyes, clutching small baskets of bread, some hiding behind their parents' knees. Farmers with sunburned cheeks and calloused hands, gripping worn staffs as if they might need them. Merchants in dull tunics, whispering bets to one another, eager to guess who would fall first. And in the midst of it all, the magistrate, seated like a small, immovable mountain, his bronze staff glinting in the sun. Gaius could see the excitement in their eyes. Not admiration, not curiosity, but a raw, visceral hunger. It was more than bloodlust. It was fascination with danger, with survival, with seeing a man confront mortality and not shrink. He felt the weight of their gaze, a tangible force pressing him toward the center of the circle. Every step toward the middle was both heavy and light, a paradox that twisted in his chest. His opponent was already there, a man from the nearby hills, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with a crooked nose that suggested past battles and survival. They nodded to one another, a small, silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. This was no dance of camaraderie. It was a ritual, a theater where lives were risked, yet understanding existed beneath the blade. The horn sounded. The crowd hushed, and the air felt electric. Every eye was on them, every whisper hanging like smoke. Gaius adjusted his grip on his gladius, feeling the leather strap cut lightly into his palm, the weight of the blade settling into familiar territory. They circled one another, movements cautious, deliberate. Clang of metal met wood. Clang of metal met metal. The crowd leaned forward as if they could merge their desire for spectacle with the action itself. Some shouted advice, others encouragement, and a few cursed quietly when a faint mist or a misstep occurred. Every reaction, every sound, fed into the rhythm of the fight. In the stands, Gaius noticed particular faces. A woman with a young child on her lap, her hand pressed over her mouth to stifle a gasp. An old man, leaning on a cane, his eyes bright with remembered battles of his own youth. A boy no older than 10, waving a small twig as though it were a sword, whispering, "Strike him, Corvus!" Even the magistrate, who usually hid behind stoic pretense, leaned forward slightly, watching the flow of movement with careful attention. It struck Gaius, these faces, so ordinary, were part of the ritual. They shaped the fight as much as any weapon or maneuver. They demanded courage, artistry, and, above all, survival. He realized that their fascination was not merely with blood, but with the tension between life and death, the dance of choice and inevitability. Each clash of swords echoed differently now. Not just the metallic ring, but the gasps, the whispers, the shifting weight of anticipation. Every movement carried meaning beyond the duel, a story being written in sweat and sand. A flick of the wrist could mean triumph or humiliation. A hesitation could invite disaster. Gaius remembered Menander's words about the delicate balance of the humors, the need for cooling, the fragile body under strain. He thought of Cassion shaping iron, each strike deliberate, precise. And now, in the center of the provincial arena, Gaius felt the culmination of both crafts, the body and the blade, the mind and the material, converging in real time. He lunged, and the man countered, steel sliding against steel. The crowd responded instantly, a wave of shouts and exclamations that rolled across the stands. Gaius's breath came fast, his chest burning, yet his mind was calm, sharpened, focused. He understood that every person watching had a story of their own, yet in this moment, all those stories converged on him. The fight slowed, a pause, not intentional, but necessary. Gaius looked into the eyes of the spectators, recognizing the fear and thrill mirrored in their expressions. For a heartbeat, the world outside the arena vanished. There was only sand, sun, the weight of the gladius, and the living tapestry of faces before him. Then, with a sudden pivot, he struck. The blade grazed his opponent's shoulder, drawing a thin line of blood. A collective gasp swept the stands, followed by murmurs of admiration and shock. The man grunted, adjusting his stance, and the fight resumed, more urgent, more alive than before. Gaius felt it then, the strange intimacy of survival, the connection between combatant and audience. Every parry, every thrust, every movement carried not just the potential for death, but the weight of being seen, of being remembered, even if only for a day. He understood why the small provincial arenas mattered. Not for grandeur, not for fame, but for the raw human drama that unfolded in their sand, under their sun, before their eyes. The crowd leaned forward, collective breaths held, the air thick with anticipation. And Gaius, moving with practiced precision, felt the strange, fierce clarity of being alive in the presence of so many who cared for a moment, however fleeting. When the horn finally sounded, signaling a pause, the sand had turned dark beneath their feet, sweat and dust clinging in equal measure. The man across from him bowed his head, acknowledging the skill and danger shared in those minutes. Gaius's own chest heaved, every muscle alive, every nerve electric. The villagers began to shout again, not for victory, not yet, but for the spectacle, for life mirrored in its most raw, immediate form. And somewhere, in the corner of his mind, Gaius felt the presence of the raven, silent, watching, waiting. The night fell over the village slowly, almost reluctantly, as though even darkness feared what the arena had witnessed that day. The crowd dispersed into their small homes, their laughter and chatter fading to the soft creak of doors and the occasional bark of a dog. The torches around the arena guttered low, casting flickering shadows that danced across the sand, shadows that seemed alive, twisting into shapes that belonged neither to man nor beast. Gaius sat against the wooden fence of the holding pen, muscles still tight from the day's fight, sweat crusted with sand, and mind sharp with exhaustion. Armin was beside him, carving another small bird from a scrap of wood. The knife slid smoothly through the grain, precise and quiet. He glanced at Gaius, eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "Did you hear?" he whispered. Gaius raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" Armin leaned closer. "About the men who left. Never came back. Out there, beyond the hills. Some say they reached freedom." Gaius didn't speak immediately. The word hung between them, fragile and absurd. Freedom. He remembered Menander's hands, steady and caring. He remembered Cassion's hammer, shaping survival. Could it be more than a dream? The others slept, or pretended to. The small pen was full of quiet murmurs, the occasional shuffle of restless feet. Gaius stared into the dark, imagining the road winding north, through forests and rivers, beyond the reach of Roman law and the expectations of the crowds. He pictured the hillsides dotted with wildflowers, the sound of wind through trees, the taste of water that had never known dust or blood. Armin continued, "They say it's dangerous. Some were caught. Others disappeared entirely. No one really knows. But the ones who survived, they speak of a life where a man chooses when to fight, not because a crowd demands it, but because he wills it." Gaius let the words sink in. He felt the weight of the chains that weren't physical, but heavier still, the chains of habit, of fear, of the arena's rhythm that never stopped. A distant howl cut through the night, and both men paused. It could have been a wolf, or a dog, or nothing at all. But it sounded like warning and promise at once. Gaius shivered, feeling the tension coil inside him. The same tension that had carried him through fights, through pain, through the gaze of hundreds of eyes. And now it carried a strange new weight, possibility. He thought of Sura, of the Thracian fights that had made him someone in the eyes of the world, someone who mattered even if only for a day. He thought of Lupus, the wolf who spoke of roads unseen and life beyond chains. He thought of the sand clinging to his skin, of the crowd's shouts, of the forge and infirmary, of all the elements that had shaped him into this moment. Gaius whispered to Armin, almost afraid to hear his own words aloud. "Do you think we could leave?" Armin's hands paused on the knife. He looked at Gaius seriously. "I don't know. Some nights I think of it as a dream. But some dreams, they're closer than you think." The men sat in silence after that, listening to the wind through the olive trees, to the distant murmur of water from a stream beyond the hills, and to the faint echo of the arena in their blood. Gaius thought of the next day, of the villagers who would come to watch again, of the magistrate counting coins, of the relentless rhythm of the games. But now, in the quiet of the night, the horizon seemed different. There was a space between what was and what could be. A place where the steps of a man could take him anywhere, if he dared. He closed his eyes briefly and let the image settle. A road winding through the hills, unseen, untamed, and waiting. No crowds, no shouting, no demands. Just the wind, the trees, and the uncertain promise of life unshackled. And somewhere, high above, a raven crossed the moon again, silent and watchful, as though approving the thought. Gaius felt a shift in his chest, a seed of resolve quietly taking root. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, perhaps, the first taste of freedom he had ever known. He didn't speak it aloud again that night. Words could be dangerous. But he carried the vision with him, folded carefully into the corners of his mind, where no guard, no lanista, no magistrate could reach. And the arena slept. The sun rose slow and heavy over the village, painting the wooden stands of the arena a dull gold. Smoke from morning fires drifted across the sand, carrying the scents of bread, roasting meat, and the faint tang of blood from yesterday's fight. The villagers gathered again, their anticipation palpable, their chatter punctuated by laughter and the clatter of children chasing each other through the narrow streets. Gaius walked with the other gladiators from their pen to the holding area, his body aching from the journey, from the fights, from the constant weight of survival pressing against his bones. There was a strange rhythm to these provincial festivals, less grand than Rome, yet no less intense. No elaborate spectacles, no elephants or exotic beasts. Here, the performance was stripped down to essentials: men, weapons, sand, and the hungry eyes of a crowd that wanted entertainment, even if it came at the cost of life. The villagers, with their simple hopes and curiosities, seemed to forget themselves in the moment. For them, the arena was not only spectacle, it was ritual, a place where the pulse of life and death could be measured in minutes, in thrusts of a sword, in the arc of a body in motion. Gaius entered the sand, gladius in hand, shield ready. Across the circle, his opponent was a lanky man from the nearby hills, sharp-eyed and wiry. They nodded once, a brief acknowledgement of the mutual understanding shared among men trained to kill or die. And then, as the horn sounded, the crowd hushed. The first clash of metal on metal rang out, harsh and deliberate. Gaius lunged, ducked, parried, each movement precise and measured, yet instinctive, honed through countless hours of training and fear. The crowd leaned forward, eyes bright, voices straining as they shouted encouragement, advice, or curses. A farmer waved a broken stick in the air, calling for blood. A mother pressed her hands over her child's eyes, glancing between fear and excitement. The laughter and shouts were layered over the metallic rhythm of combat, a song that filled the small village arena with raw, human intensity. Gaius felt the paradox of this spectacle. The villagers celebrated life by watching death, exulted in skill while savoring pain. Every strike, every feint, every maneuver was a dialogue between survival and the crowd's appetite for drama. He parried a swift attack, then countered, striking the man's shoulder. A shallow cut, not deadly, but enough to draw a gasp and a cheer. The opponent, gritting his teeth, responded with speed, forcing Gaius back. Somewhere in the stands, a boy whispered to his friend, "Look, he's Corvus. See how he moves." The words were small, but they carried weight. Each spectator, unaware of the subtle grace required to survive, added pressure to every decision, every movement. And Gaius, moving in rhythm with the sand and the blade, realized that this performance was as much about psychology as skill. Reading the crowd as much as the opponent, predicting reactions, exploiting expectation. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the fighters, turning sweat into dust and dust into a second skin. Gaius's chest burned, his ribs ached, his hands were blistered, yet his mind was sharper than ever. He could feel the flow of energy through the circle, the collective heartbeat of the crowd, and the subtle movements of his opponent. Every step mattered, every breath, every twitch of a muscle. When the duel reached its climax, Gaius feinted left and struck right, glancing his opponent's chest just enough to draw a spurt of blood. The man staggered, eyes wide, chest heaving, and the crowd erupted, cheers and cries overlapping in a cacophony of joy and fear. Some clapped, some shouted for mercy, some whistled, fascinated by the delicate balance between survival and spectacle. The magistrate raised his bronze staff, signaling the end. Gaius lowered his gladius, chest heaving, muscles trembling. The opponent fell to one knee, nodding in respect. The villagers erupted again, their cheers now a mixture of relief and celebration, their faces alive with the thrill of witnessing danger close at hand. As the men were led back to their pens, Gaius noticed the subtle details: a child's wide eyes still fixed on him, a mother brushing dirt from her son's tunic, an old man shaking his head in disbelief. These faces, ordinary and extraordinary at once, were as much a part of the arena as the sand or the steel. He realized that the provincial festivals were different from the grand spectacles in Rome, but no less potent. Here, the crowd was intimately close, personal, a web of human emotion pressing in on every strike and parry. Every man who fought left not only scars on his own body, but also etched impressions into the hearts and minds of those who watched. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the crowds dispersed. Merchants gathered their goods, children ran home, and the villagers returned to the rhythm of their lives. The arena, once again, fell silent. Sand turned to dust, blood partially hidden, the echo of cheers fading into memory. Gaius sat alone for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling the ache in every muscle, the tension of the day slowly unwinding. The day had ended, but the rhythm of survival, of expectation, of life measured against death, would continue. And somewhere in the shadows, he could still feel the quiet whisper of escape. A road beyond the village, beyond the crowds, beyond the arena itself. The sun set, painting the sky crimson, and Gaius allowed himself a brief moment of thought. Perhaps tomorrow, the celebration would resume. Perhaps tomorrow, the rhythm of blood and cheer would begin again. And perhaps, someday, he could walk away, into a world waiting beyond the circle of sand. The dawn broke slowly over the village, the sky painted with soft strokes of orange and pink. Gaius sat on the edge of the pen, watching the early light touch the sand of the arena, still warm from yesterday's battles. His body ached in familiar ways, ribs stiff, shoulders sore, hands blistered, but his mind was restless, turning over the possibilities of escape, survival, and the rhythm of the games. It was then that he noticed him, an older man, seated quietly in the corner of the pen, sharpening a gladius with painstaking precision. He had been there before, of course. All the men in the ludus had seen him, but today, for some reason, he caught Gaius's attention. There was something different in the way the older gladiator moved, deliberate, almost ceremonial, every motion controlled, every breath measured. The man was called Marcellus. A veteran of the arenas, his face lined with scars and age, his hair streaked with gray, and eyes that had seen too much and survived. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were careful, precise, carrying the weight of experience rather than authority. Gaius approached him cautiously. "Marcellus," he said softly. The older man glanced up, eyes flickering with interest but no judgment. "You fight well," Marcellus said simply, returning his gaze to the blade. "Better than most who come from Capua." Gaius shifted uncomfortably. I want to survive. More than anything." Marcellus let the words hang between them, then nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Survival," he said, "is not in strength alone. It is in perception. In understanding who watches, who whispers, and who expects your failure." He gestured to the sand beyond the pen. "The crowd is a river. You can't fight the current, only navigate it. Their eyes, their breath, their fear, it is all part of the fight. If you ignore it, you will fall. If you understand it, you can bend it to your advantage." Gaius listened intently. He had noticed the faces in the crowd, the children, the mothers, the old men, the merchants, the subtle ways they influenced the rhythm of the fight. But Marcellus's words gave it shape, turned the scattered observations into something tangible. "Every man has a weakness," Marcellus continued, lifting the gladius and testing its edge with a gentle strike against his own palm. "Some are in the body, some in the mind. You must learn to see both, in your opponent and in yourself. Control one, and the other will follow." Gaius frowned, trying to understand. "How do you see it?" he asked. Marcellus smiled faintly. "You watch, you wait, you breathe. You notice the twitch of a muscle, the shift of weight, the way the crowd leans with expectation. Everything has meaning, if you have the patience to read it." They trained together in silence most of the day. Marcellus moved slowly, demonstrating subtle feints, the redirection of momentum, the timing of a step just before a lunge. Gaius mirrored him, feeling the difference between raw strength and calculated precision. Every movement became a conversation, a negotiation between body, mind, and environment. At one point, Marcellus paused and looked toward the village. "See them," he said softly. "The ones in the shadows, the quiet faces? They are the ones who notice most. The ones who whisper, who calculate. Pay attention to them. They are as important as any sword." Gaius began to understand. The arena was more than a place of blood and sand. It was a stage, a network, a puzzle. To survive, he would need more than skill. He would need awareness, patience, and a careful reading of every layer. The opponent, the crowd, the lanista, the guards, and even the whispers in the dark. When the sun began to fall, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, Marcellus leaned back on his heels. "You have potential," he said quietly. "But potential without understanding is just another way to die. Learn to see. Learn to wait. And then—" He let the words trail off, the implication clear. Survival was a matter of knowing when to act, and when to hold back. Gaius nodded, feeling the weight of it settle into his bones. For the first time, the arena seemed less like a place of terror and more like a classroom. Harsh, unforgiving, but full of lessons. That night, as he lay on the hard wooden floor of the pen, Gaius replayed every movement of the day in his mind, every lesson from Marcellus, every twitch and glance. The images of the provincial crowd, the sun-bleached sand, and the faint shadows of escape beyond the hills wove together into a single, intricate map. And for the first time, he could see a path, narrow, perilous, but undeniably real. Outside, the village slept, the arena silent. And somewhere, a raven cried once, its call echoing across the hills, as if marking the beginning of a new understanding, a shift in the rhythm of life, in the heartbeat of survival. Night fell quickly over the village, thick and silent, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant crow of a rooster preparing for tomorrow's dawn. The arena, small and bare, was illuminated by torches set along the perimeter, their flickering light casting long, dancing shadows across the sand. The villagers had returned, drawn not by day's heat but by the allure of darkness, a spectacle that promised fear as much as skill, mystery as much as blood. This was the Festival of Shadows, a night fight where the provincial crowds demanded thrills heightened by dim light and distorted perception. Gaius stood at the edge of the sand, feeling the uneven grains under his sandals, the gladius snug in his hand, and the weight of anticipation pressing down on him. Across the circle, his opponent was tall and broad, a hulking man from the northern hills, his face painted with streaks of charcoal to appear more fearsome in the torchlight. The spectacle was as much about illusion as combat, shadows magnified, movements distorted, and every flicker of flame adding drama to the fight. The horn sounded, and the arena came alive. Torches trembled in the hands of the villagers, shadows leapt and merged, creating phantom shapes that seemed to move independently of their owners. Gaius's eyes darted constantly, reading the movements of both the man across from him and the crowd. Each cheer, each gasp, each whispered warning carried information, subtle shifts in expectation he could exploit. The first clash of metal rang sharp and loud, echoing across the small wooden stands. Gaius feinted, stepping lightly, his shadow stretching unnaturally along the sand. The crowd leaned forward, caught between excitement and fear, their shadows merging with the flickering flame in a strange, living tapestry. The northern man lunged, and Gaius parried, feeling the blade vibrate through his arm. Every spark of metal against metal reflected in the eyes of the villagers, magnifying the tension. Marcellus had taught him well. Read the body, read the mind, read the river of faces surrounding you. Gaius felt the lessons in real time, the hesitation of the man's step when the crowd roared, the slight tilt of his wrist when children screamed in alarm, the pull of the crowd's gaze influencing both fighters' rhythm. Survival was not just about skill, it was about perception, patience, and understanding the story the arena demanded. As they circled, Gaius noticed subtle patterns. The magistrate, seated on his wooden platform, shifted slightly whenever one man faltered, signaling approval or disapproval to the crowd without a word. A merchant in the front row cheered louder when blood spattered across the sand, egging the combatants into riskier maneuvers. Even the children had their voices, small but insistent, whispering advice to their favorites. The fight became a dance of shadow and steel, a rhythm influenced as much by perception as by muscle. Gaius struck again, this time grazing the man's side, and the northern stumbled slightly, his movements exaggerated in the torchlight. The crowd roared, and the shadows around him seemed to grow taller, larger, more menacing. Fear and excitement intertwined, a force almost tangible in the night air. Gaius understood, suddenly, that this festival was more than spectacle. It was manipulation, a subtle choreography between crowd and lanista, between expectation and reality, designed to heighten the stakes without changing the rules of life and death. He had survived the day, and now he would survive the night by reading the invisible currents around him. When the horn sounded again, signaling a pause, the sand was dark with sweat and blood, shadows flickering against the wooden planks. The villagers erupted into applause, laughter, and occasional groans, their emotions raw and immediate. The northern man staggered, exhausted, and Gaius lowered his gladius, muscles trembling but heart steady. Marcellus watched from the corner, silent, eyes reflecting the torchlight. Gaius approached him quietly. "It's different," he whispered. "At night, everything changes. Marcellus nodded. The arena is always the same. But the perception, the fear, it is a weapon. Learn to use it, and the shadows will fight for you. That night, back in the holding pen, Gaius lay awake, feeling the echoes of cheers and gasps lingering in his mind. The Festival of Shadows had shown him a new dimension of survival. Not just the fight of sword against sword, but the battle of perception, anticipation, and understanding the invisible forces that shaped life in the arena. Outside, the torches burned low, flickering across the village rooftops. A raven cried somewhere in the distance, a single, haunting note cutting through the night. Gaius closed his eyes and let it echo in his mind, imagining the road beyond the hills, the faint possibility of freedom, and the certainty that tomorrow, and every day after, the arena would demand more than strength. It would demand cunning, patience, and the courage to see the unseen. The morning after the Festival of Shadows was quiet, almost deceptively so. The village stirred slowly, smoke curling from chimneys, the distant bleating of goats, and the faint creak of carts carrying supplies over uneven roads. But for Gaius, the calm was temporary, a thin veil covering the weight of what had been endured the night before. His muscles ached in ways that reminded him of every fight he had survived, every cut, every bruise, every near miss. The price of glory, he realized, was measured not in applause, but in the silent tally of injuries, exhaustion, and the invisible scars that etched themselves into the mind. In the holding pen, men stirred, stretching, groaning, rubbing shoulders, wrists, and backs. Some moved quickly, eager to practice again, to fight again, as though each bout could earn them survival or fame. Others, like Gaius, moved slowly, each motion deliberate, acknowledging the body's demands for rest while balancing the mind's unrelenting awareness. Marcellus approached, moving with quiet precision. He examined Gaius with a trained eye, scanning his posture, the tension in his arms, the slight twist of his shoulders. "You carry more than just fatigue," he said, voice low. Gaius tilted his head. "Pain." Marcellus shook his head slightly. "Memory. Fear. Pride. Every fight leaves its mark. You may walk away, but your body and mind remember." Gaius understood. He had felt it in the night, the tension of the crowd, the shadow of the torchlight, the anticipation that wrapped around him like a second skin. It was intoxicating, this mix of fear and admiration, life and the threat of death. But the intoxication had a cost. As he moved toward the training yard, he saw the others already at work. Some sparred gently, testing reflexes, adjusting technique. Others nursed injuries, wrapping arms, tending bruises, exchanging quiet advice. Even in these small provincial arenas, the network of care and observation existed, subtle, often silent, but vital for survival. Gaius's opponent from the night before approached, nodding curtly. "Tomorrow," the man said simply, "we fight again." Gaius nodded, feeling the unspoken tension that existed between men who shared danger yet carried private fears. They were competitors, yes, but each recognized the other as part of the fragile ecosystem of survival. Every mistake could be fatal, every misjudgment amplified by the small, attentive crowd watching closely. The day passed in a rhythm of training, tending wounds, and observing the villagers. Gaius began to notice subtler aspects of the provincial games, how the crowd influenced morale, how the lanista manipulated expectations, how small injuries, unnoticed at first, could accumulate into severe disadvantage. Even minor bruises could affect balance. Small cuts could sap stamina over days. Each man carried these hidden costs silently, knowing that the show must go on, that the crowd expected spectacle, and that the lanista demanded obedience. By afternoon, a minor injury from sparring reminded Gaius that the price of glory was immediate and unforgiving. A glancing blow to the ribs brought a sharp ache, breathing shallow and painful. He clenched his jaw, focusing not on the pain itself, but on controlling every movement, every breath. This was survival, endurance measured not just by strength, but by the ability to manage injury, fear, and anticipation simultaneously. Marcellus observed from a distance, then approached with a small wooden bowl of water and herbs. "Drink," he said simply. Gaius obeyed, letting the cool liquid slide down, easing the tightness in his chest. "Remember," Marcellus continued, "glory has a cost. Do not let it blind you. Pride can be as lethal as any sword." That evening, Gaius sat alone on the edge of the pen, cleaning his gladius carefully, inspecting each dent, each scratch. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching across the sand. The torches from the previous night burned low in memory but left their echo in his mind. The thought of escape lingered faintly, an ember barely glowing beneath layers of obligation, expectation, and fear. Yet he knew that the provincial arenas would continue to demand sacrifices, in flesh, in spirit, in patience, in the quiet acceptance of danger. Outside, the villagers' laughter and chatter faded with the setting sun. The arena slept, but its lessons remained, every strike, every shadow, every cheer, every gasp recorded in the minds and bodies of those who survived. And in the corners of his mind, Gaius felt the weight of understanding. To fight for glory was to accept the invisible toll, to carry it silently, and to continue, day after day, in the dance of survival and spectacle. The raven cried once in the distance, a sharp, solitary note, as if reminding him that even in darkness, life, and choice, persisted. Gaius closed his eyes, letting the day's lessons sink into his bones, feeling the price of glory in every fiber of himself, and knowing that tomorrow would demand more. Night came quickly, pressing its cool weight over the village. Yet the arena seemed alive long after the villagers had retreated to their homes. The torches along the outer perimeter sputtered in the wind, casting long, uncertain shadows across the sand. Gaius lay on the hard wooden floor of the pen, the ache of muscles and bruises from the previous day still fresh, yet his mind refused to rest. Sleep was a stranger. It never lasted more than a few minutes before whispers and distant sounds pulled him back to awareness. He heard a movement near the corner of the pen, a faint shuffle that might have been imagination. Armin was there, crouched low, eyes bright in the torchlight. "Gaius," he whispered, voice barely audible. "Have you heard?" He paused, listening to the wind through the olive trees, the faint rustle of animals in the distance. "They're talking. Some of the men, the older ones, the ones who've been around longer. They speak of a path beyond the hills. Not all of them, only a few. They whisper it in corners, when the magistrate isn't looking." Gaius sat up slowly, heart thudding. The road beyond the hills, he had imagined it, dreamed of it, even feared it, and now, whispers of it moved like threads through the holding pen. "Is it possible?" he asked quietly. Armin shrugged. "Some say yes. Some say the Romans catch them before they ever leave. Some never return." The night air carried a mixture of salt and dust, a lingering scent of blood from the previous fights, and a strange thrill that made the hairs on Gaius's neck rise. He realized that the whispers themselves were dangerous. Rumors of escape could inspire hope, but hope in a place like this could be fatal. Yet the ember of possibility glowed brighter than ever, warming the cold ache in his chest. He slipped from his cot and moved closer to the corner of the pen where Marcellus sat silently, sharpening a blade even in the darkness. The older man's eyes caught Gaius's and studied him, reading without words. "Curiosity is survival," Marcellus said softly, "but knowledge without caution can kill you as surely as a gladius. Be careful what you seek tonight." Gaius nodded, swallowing the nervous energy rising in his stomach. He could feel it, the stirrings of something forbidden, something dangerous, something thrilling. Even in these provincial arenas, with the crowds small and the stands wooden, danger had many forms. Not only the opponent's sword, not only the magistrate's orders, but also the allure of freedom, the whispered possibilities, the unknown that lay beyond every hill. Armin motioned toward a group of older gladiators in the far corner, shadows moving with deliberate caution. "They meet at night," he whispered. "They speak softly about routes, about rivers, about villages that might hide them, about life outside the sand." Gaius's pulse quickened. He imagined walking through fields unobserved, the sun on his back, the wind not carrying the scent of fear but of grass and freedom. It seemed almost unreal, yet the shadows around the pen suggested that some part of it was real, alive, pulsing just out of reach. The night stretched, long and quiet, the whispers ebbing and flowing like water over stone. Gaius listened, taking mental notes, trying to discern truth from exaggeration, possibilities from lies. Each sound carried meaning. The shuffle of sandals, the soft voice of a man speaking only to his neighbor, the faint clink of metal as a blade was tested or cleaned. Everything was a signal, if one knew how to read it. Hours passed. The moon rose high, silver and cold, illuminating the arena in an eerie light. Gaius lay back, breathing slowly, letting his mind map the whispers, the possibilities, the shadows that hinted at paths unknown. Freedom might exist, he realized. Not guaranteed. Not easy. Not safe. But it existed. Somewhere beyond the olive trees, a raven cried, sharp and singular, cutting through the silence. Gaius's heart stirred at the sound, a strange confirmation that life beyond the arena was more than just a dream. He closed his eyes and let the whispers guide him in his imagination, tracing hidden paths, secret routes, and unseen doors to a world beyond the provincial games. By the time dawn approached, the pen was quiet. The other men slept, curled in their cots, unaware of the possibilities unfolding in their midst. Gaius remained awake for a while longer, tracing the whispers in his mind, feeling for the pulse of hope that, until now, had only existed in fleeting imagination. The arena slept. The villagers still dreamed their small, safe dreams. And Gaius, heart pounding with anticipation and fear, realized that the price of life here was not only blood and sweat, it was the constant weighing of possibilities, the careful listening to whispers that promised freedom or death in equal measure. The sun had barely begun to stretch its pale fingers over the hills when Gaius stirred, the ache in his muscles reminding him that yesterday's battles were not yet fully behind him. He moved carefully through the pen, muscles stiff, eyes alert. The whispers from the night before clung to him like a second skin, each word and nuance replaying in his mind. If there was a path to freedom, he needed to know it, not blindly, not recklessly, but with precision and patience. Marcellus sat in his usual corner, silently observing the faint morning mist that clung to the arena's wooden structures. He didn't speak. He rarely did unless he had something important to say. Gaius approached cautiously. "I think I can find it," he said softly. Marcellus raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge. "Not by force," the older man finally replied, "but by attention, patience, and understanding. The shadows are mapped in more than land. They are in behavior, in routine, in expectation." Gaius nodded. He began to move through the holding area, observing quietly. A younger man, restless, tapping a foot, glancing toward the guards. Nervous energy that might betray plans. An older fighter, silent and deliberate, checking his weapons slowly, eyes flicking toward corners of the pen as if expecting an unseen threat. The guards themselves, predictable in their routines, checking locks, counting torches, inspecting the fences, moving in patterns almost as predictable as the rising sun. It became a game of observation, a mental map unfolding in his mind. Every noise, every glance, every routine became a coordinate, a potential key, or a hidden hazard. He noticed where the shadows fell at dawn, how they hid movements, how the flicker of torchlight might conceal a slip or signal an opening. By midday, Gaius had begun to imagine routes through the village, beyond the hills, piecing together invisible connections. A cart track running behind the olive groves, often empty in the afternoons. A stream that meandered north, shallow enough to wade, thick reeds offering cover from watchful eyes. Houses on the edge of the village whose owners were rumored to turn a blind eye to strange wanderers at night. Every observation was a brushstroke, forming a mental map that might guide a man, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. Yet he knew the dangers were real. One misstep, one hurried move, and the path could end in capture, punishment, or death. And the other gladiators were unpredictable. Trust was rare, and alliances fleeting. Some whispered of escape for hope's sake, others for amusement, some for power. Gaius could not rely on anyone completely. He had to test, observe, and interpret every intention. Marcellus approached in the late afternoon, eyes narrowing as he noticed Gaius tracing imaginary lines in the dirt with a stick. "You're thinking too openly," Marcellus warned. "The mind maps the terrain, yes, but do not let it map intentions. People watch. People listen. Move carefully, even here, even now." Gaius nodded, scratching faint lines into the sand with the tip of his blade. He understood. The arena, the village, the pen, all were layers of shadow. The path to freedom was not a straight line, it was a maze of perception, observation, and timing. That night, as torches flickered and the villagers slept, Gaius lay awake again. The mental map had grown, branching outward like roots seeking water. He traced routes with his finger in the air, imagining the sweep of hills, the twists of streams, the cover of trees. He noted the predictable patterns of guards and fellow gladiators, the fleeting habits that might betray opportunity. Outside, the raven cried again, its sound slicing through the darkness, a familiar, almost ritual note. Gaius closed his eyes, imagining moving through shadows, following the map in his mind, silent, unseen, alive. The map was more than geography. It was timing, rhythm, anticipation, the map of survival itself. He realized with a strange clarity that freedom was not found by brute strength or sudden action. It was a subtle dance, measured, patient, informed by observation, shaped by shadows, and guided by the quietest whispers in the night. And in the growing darkness, with the torches casting flickering light across the pen, Gaius felt the pulse of possibility. The map was ready. He would need patience, caution, and courage. But for the first time, the horizon beyond the village seemed less like a dream and more like a destination within reach. The day began quietly, with the sun spilling soft light over the worn planks of the arena stands. Gaius moved among the gladiators, careful, deliberate, noting every glance, every gesture, every unspoken signal. The whispers from the previous nights had not faded. If anything, they had multiplied, weaving themselves through the pen like threads in a hidden tapestry. Some men spoke cautiously, hinting at possibilities, while others laughed too loudly, pretending indifference but betraying curiosity. Gaius knew that in this provincial arena, alliances were fragile. Trust was currency more precious than gold, and betrayal could come as swiftly as a gladius through flesh. Yet to move beyond the pen, to the hills, to the hope of freedom, he would need partners. Men willing to act when the moment demanded, men who could read both the shadows and the crowd. He approached Lucius, a tall, lean fighter with keen eyes and a reputation for cleverness rather than brute strength. Lucius had survived here longer than most, and Gaius had observed him for weeks, noticing the subtle ways he navigated both combat and social tension. "You speak little," Lucius remarked softly as Gaius joined him. "And watch much," Gaius replied. They studied each other in silence for a moment. In the pen, silence was language. It carried meaning, suspicion, and understanding. "I hear whispers," Lucius finally said. "Some men talk of the hills, of freedom. Few believe it possible. Fewer dare to act." Gaius nodded. "I've been mapping, watching. I see patterns. I see paths." Lucius's eyes narrowed. "And yet you haven't spoken to anyone else?" "Trust must be earned," Gaius said. "I will not risk a misstep. I will not risk exposing the idea too soon. Not until I know who can be counted on." Lucius considered this, tapping the tip of his blade against the sand. "Very well," he said after a pause. "I watch with you. I test with you. And when the time comes, we move. Together, if possible." It was a small beginning, but it felt like a fragile spark in the dark. Gaius realized that bonds formed in shadows were often stronger than those formed in light, forged not by spectacle, but by necessity, by shared risk, by understanding the rules of survival. The rest of the day passed in cautious observation. Gaius noted which gladiators were restless, which were careful, which were clever enough to manipulate the guard's routine. He paid attention to the lanista, who moved through the holding area with practiced authority, eyes sharp for any hint of dissent or secret planning. He observed which villagers lingered near the pen, their curiosity harmless yet potentially dangerous if misread. At night, whispers continued, more deliberate now. Men moved in small groups, speaking softly, exchanging gestures and glances. Gaius and Lucius stayed apart from the larger clusters, listening, cataloging, assessing. Some whispers were false, designed to mislead. Others carried truth hidden in layers of ambiguity. Learning to distinguish between the two was as crucial as knowing how to parry a gladius or read a crowd. Marcellus approached silently, as he often did, sitting beside them without announcement. "You understand what is at stake," he said quietly. "These men may be friends. They may not. They will test your patience, your judgment, your willingness to act. But one bond is stronger than any blade: understanding. Observe. Wait. Act only when necessary." Gaius nodded, feeling the weight of the lesson sink into his mind. Survival was not only about strength or skill. It was about perception, patience, and careful choice of allies. The bonds formed in shadow were subtle, delicate, yet capable of carrying a man beyond the arena, beyond the village, beyond chains that had seemed unbreakable. When the torches were extinguished, and the pen sank into the quiet of night, Gaius lay awake, tracing the contours of possibility. Lucius's presence beside him was reassuring, a reminder that trust, though rare, could exist. The whispers of escape, the map of hidden paths, and the careful observation of allies and enemies all combined into a single, delicate strategy. Outside, the raven called once more, its voice carrying over the hills. Gaius closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the arena, the rhythm of shadows, and the fragile, flickering bond that might one day guide him beyond the sand. He understood clearly. Survival depended not only on the strength of arms but on the strength of insight, the patience of the mind, and the courage to place trust where it might matter most.